right, students, welcome to 13.3. I've hopefully corrected the audio issues that I was having. Finally found the problem and addressed it. But let's go ahead and start right into this lecture here so we can get you on your way. All right, so when we start looking at the Civil War, it doesn't just happen. It doesn't just one day show up that other country, that the other side of the country is upset with what's going on. Instead, there's a combination of events, and there's definitely groups of people that push towards an end of slavery that inflame tensions within the country. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. One of the things is that with polarization, and one of the fascinating aspects is you're seeing that today in America, where there is distinct polarization in our political parties right now and with people who believe in certain political ideologies. Now, am I saying a civil war is coming? No, but I am saying that there is distinct polarization. And when we're talking about the Civil War, what you're going to find is that if polarization gets too extreme, then neither side can compromise with each other anymore. That's one thing that's supposed to be designed and built into our government structure is the willingness for groups to come together and compromise in order to find solutions to our nation's problem. And so these groups right here, they get to that point where they look at one side and they determine that one side is pure evil, and another side looks at the other group and says they're trying to destroy our way of life. And so they look at each other as enemies now. They no longer look at each other as fellow citizens. They instead see a force that is trying to create a problem for the other, and it is a moral issue that becomes a problem with it. And that's what we talk about today, is we are starting to see the split between people of instead of saying, what are the things that we agree with? Instead, you hear language like what they're doing is evil, what they're doing is wrong and is illegal. You're seeing this across the board where people are saying this one group is on one side too far that I can no longer accept them and their ideas. And up in the north, one of the big things is this becomes a moral and religious issue for many of them. If you guys remember, I've talked about this a few times. Lots of abolitionist movements are really based around Christian beliefs. It really kicks off after the Second Great Awakening, and it's a change in American culture that starts to polarize these people, saying, if we're talking about being religious people and people that believe in a higher power, and if we truly are adhering to our Constitution, then all men are supposed to be created equal, and therefore slavery is an unjust act, and therefore they need to be freed. And so they really start to hold the line as to this is an immoral act. And they start making political parties that are completely dedicated to the cause of eradicating slavery. And so the North is really starting to mobilize political and citizens to fight against the establishment of the slave system down in the South. The South, on the other hand, they decide they're going to continue to try to entrench it into their society even further. And when I say that, you actually, if you go back and you research and you study some of the documents that come out of the South during the Civil War, and you look at even some of the religious literature that comes out, you can find pastors and priests and other people using the Bible to defend the idea of slavery and say, look, the Bible says that it's morally correct, so therefore it is, and what we are doing is right in the eyes of God. So it's a really fascinating study of how people justify either the pro or the con position in slavery. All right, so one of the big events, and we've talked about the establishment of this when we were looking at compromises, remember in 1850? And when we look at one of the compromises they made, it was the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law was hated in the North. And I don't mean just kind of hated. It was massively objectionable to the people in the North. They fought it with everything that they could. And what is the Fugitive Slave Law? Why were people so opposed to it? Well, there was a couple things. This is that first and foremost, if a slave escaped into the North, it used to be if you were in the North, you were free. And there had been people up in the North for 20, 30, 40 years that were living now free up in the North who were former slaves. What this law allowed was for federal and state resources in the North to be used by people who are trying to recapture escaped slaves. So, for example, one of the most glaring events was in Boston, where the police force was mobilized to try and capture a few runaway slaves, and it cost thousands of dollars. It was a massive financial drain on the system. And after that, Boston pretty much said, we're no longer going to enforce this law. We're not going to take the time, the effort, the manpower, the resources. Forget it. We're not going to do it anymore. And so you start seeing more cities in the North do that too. They look at it and they're like, no way. We're not going to waste money on this. But it still allowed for basically what you'd consider like bounty hunters hired by southern plantation owners to go north and find escaped slaves. And some of the things that they did was very unethical. I mean, the whole thing's unethical, but more unethical in certain terminology when you look at it, where they would go up and they would find people that had escaped slavery 20, 30 years ago, and they would catch them and bring them back down to the South and re-enslave them. In fact, they would grab freemen, and all it would take would be the witness of one white person to say, no, they were a slave, and they could take them back and enslave them in the South, even if they've never been born into bondage. So you start seeing people captured and spirited away into the night and put into forced servitude, even if they've never been enslaved before. So this becomes a really big problem in the North, and eventually mobs start to rise up, and they would break some of the slaves out of prison, chase off these kind of bounty hunters that would come up north and, attack them and force them out of their cities. So it becomes a very polarizing law too, where the North pretty much completely rejects enforcement of the law. And remember, when we looked at that in the South tried to do that with tariffs, kind of nullification ideas. However, they didn't move towards it and strike it down and say, as a state, we're not going to enforce it because it's unconstitutional. That was more the Southern view. But the North used their states' rights and said, no, we're not going to enforce these laws. We're just going to ignore the law itself. We're not trying to say, hey, it needs to be revoked based upon some constitutional issue. They said, we're just not going to do it. So the fugitive slave law, though, massive splitting point between the North and the South during this time. You start to see, really, again, the rise of abolitionists. We've talked quite a bit about the abolitionists. Remember, their main goal here is to abolish slavery in the United States. That's it. That's what they're for. Now, admittedly, if you do study some of the writings of some of the abolitionist leaders, and especially many of the women who were part of the abolitionist movement, they took on a number and a litany of moral issues, often temperance, also women's roles, gaining greater access. And some of these women that start in the abolitionist movements are ones that you will see later on in women's rights movement. But the idea of abolition, though, is often very heavily based, again, like I say, this is why I always bring up the idea you need to study both ideas in U.S. history, not just looking at societal trends, but also looking at religious trends in the United States, because religious trends push forward people from the abolitionist movement. If there was never the Second Great Awakening, it's quite likely that it would have, anti-slavery movements would have been political in nature, but instead they're grounded in religion, and this is what pushes that idea of polarization. That's why I bring it up, is because polarization becomes firmer entrenched and has a greater likelihood of being hardened on each side when religion starts to play a role in it. So you have to remember and kind of look at those items. And there's a number of books about it out there if you're ever interested in studying it. I've studied it quite a bit in my studies of antebellum America during this time frame. Anyways, they also fight against the moral ideas that the South's trying to present as slavery being just and right. And we've already kind of talked about the Southerners doing the same thing. All right. We've talked about also these people too. A lot of this is kind of refreshing moments for you guys because we're leading up to the Civil War. So it's important to know some of these players in the abolitionist movement. There is a problem in the North, okay? So they're for freeing slaves. They see slavery as unjust and immoral. However, at the same time, you need to understand that Northerners, like white Northern men, were not too eager at having a large group of free slaves now move north and take their factory jobs, because they had a fear that if you now suddenly have this massive free population, they're not going to stay in the South and work on the farms. Instead, they're going to make their way north and work factory positions. And they knew for a fact that the northern industrialists would exploit the black workers and have them work for a lower wage than even what the poor white immigrants were making. So there's still a pushback from northern white males for fear over jobs and economic issues. But anyways, you still do have strong voices in the abolitionist movement. Of course, we've talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe. You have Sojourner Truth. She's an escaped slave. She writes quite a bit about slavery and her experiences under it. Same with Frederick Douglass, another escaped slave, writes excellent commentaries through his newspaper and his pamphleteering. Frederick Douglass is a fascinating person. His debates and meetings with Lincoln are fascinating too to look at. So if you're really wanting to study a great abolitionist leader and one who is eloquent and well educated and really fine tunes arguments, Frederick Douglass, make sure you read him. All right. So there's a few efforts that start to happen in order to help free slaves. Of course, the most well-known one that we have is Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. It was a very complex system, and people don't realize how complicated it was. You had numerous people who were involved in moving slaves north, and so the slaves would escape. They'd usually move at night, and then in the daytime they would stay at an Underground Railroad's like proprietor of their home or other hideouts, locations, places that they'd ensure that they could stay warm, eat, and be able to be hidden away so they're not staying out in the open and being able to be hunted down by fugitive slave hunters. And some northern businessmen took enormous financial risk hiding some of these slaves. So doing this was a risky venture because you could be fined heavily and you could lose large amounts of your property and estate. And some of the people did sacrifice that and did lose huge sums of money trying to protect and help people escape slavery. Excuse me. All right. And here's a really fascinating one. John Brown. John Brown, he really comes out of the Western Territory. I kind of call them wars, but you can call them conflicts between bringing in Kansas and Nebraska. There's a reason why those are considered like bleeding Kansas, because they do turn violent. And John Brown really cuts his teeth out on the frontier of being a violent abolitionist, which means that he was more than willing to take up arms and commit acts of violence in order to end slavery. So he had this idea in 1859. He took his sons and a group of former slaves, and what they come up with is an idea that they're going to go and attack and take over Harper's Ferry, which is a large armory. Basically, there's guns, gunpowder, bullets, cannons. It has everything needed to raise up an army and start a war, basically. And so he has this idea that they are going to go attack and take Harper's Ferry, and then they were going to instigate a massive slave uprising, arm them all with these rifles and military supplies, and go and wage a war of freedom against southern plantation and farmers, owners. And so him and his sons and these slaves, they go and they attack Harper's Ferries. It's a small group of them, but they manage to take over the armory for a few days. Robert E. Lee is sent down with a military company, and over the course of 2 days of trying to negotiate and getting into gunfights where a number of people are killed, eventually John Brown, he gives up and is taken into custody. And this is where he becomes even more famous. I mean, if he had just taken over the armory, that would be one thing and he'd be a footnote in history. But he was brought to trial on treason. And throughout the trial, in his defense that he was presenting, he was extraordinarily eloquent with his speech and how he justified his actions and why he was an abolitionist and why slavery was wrong. And he kind of becomes a folk hero up in the North of somebody who was willing to take up a cause in the fight against slavery and put his own life on the line. Eventually, though, John Brown is convicted of treason and is hung and killed along with a number of his sons. So John Brown, he's a true abolitionist to the soul, where he was like, I'm willing to engage in violent revolution to try to end slavery. And he had kind of hoped to kick off a civil war to really force a military confrontation against Southern slavery. And he comes pretty close to it. If he was given a little bit more time, he might have been able to rouse up enough people. Unfortunately for him, not very many people knew about his plan, and not a bunch of slaves did not just suddenly get up and run over to Harper's Ferry and arm themselves. But once this is seen, though, it's one of the things that pushes the South to further entrench and try to include slavery into the U.S. Constitution and pass stronger slavery protections. Because they look at people like John Brown, they're like, look, you Northerners are trying to even come down here and violently take away. And remember, they think slaves are property. You're trying to violently come down here and take our rightful property. And so this really creates greater divides within it, because you're seeing that the South is going, in order to protect and keep slavery, either A, we get it constitutionally protected, or B, we leave and we can keep slavery down here with us. And so that's where they start getting into this thought process of, what are we going to do? Are we going to revolt? Are we going to leave the Union? What steps do we need to take in order to preserve slavery in the South? All right, that ends this unit right here. Make sure you go ahead and do the quiz and the homework. Also, there is a retake correction policy quiz that I need you to review and to take too. It's worth 5 points, so make sure you understand the policy and are able to answer the question correctly. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow.